I made this statement in committee when I presented this bill, and I firmly believe it, or this resolution. I firmly believe that this is the most important resolution we'll be voting on this year. I would like to start out by reading Article 5 of the United States Constitution. The Congress, whenever two-thirds of both houses shall deem it necessary, shall propose amendments to this Constitution, or, now this is the key word, on the application of the legislatures of two-thirds of several states, shall call a convention for proposing amendments, which in either case shall be valid to all intents and purposes as part of this Constitution when ratified by the legislatures of three-fourths of the several states, or by conventions in three-fourths thereof, as the one or the other mode of ratification may be proposed by the Congress, provided that no amendment which may be made prior to the year 1808 shall in any manner affect the first and fourth clauses in the 9th section of the first article, and that no state without its consent shall be deprived of its equal suffrage in the Senate. Senate Joint Resolution 67 is an application to Congress to call for a convention of states. This last year, we passed a resolution calling for a convention of states limited to a balanced federal budget. I believe it's important to apply to Congress for this broader call because the problems that need to be addressed are not limited just to the budget. This call is limited to proposing amendments to the United States Constitution that, first, impose fiscal restraints on the federal government. The fiscal irresponsibility that's led to an almost $18 trillion debt is bipartisan. Both parties are to blame. Let's just look at the last four administrations. Under George H.W. Bush, our debt increased by 52%. Under President Clinton, our debt increased by 37%. Under George W. Bush, our debt increased by 86%. And during the first 4 years of President Obama, our debt has increased 45%. The second area that the call would be limited to is to limit the power and jurisdiction of the federal government. Earlier this year, Senator Norris brought legislation urging Congress to propose a constitutional amendment relative to the regulatory authority of the executive branch. During discussions on that legislation, we talked about the federal government's regulating school bake sales, the new rules being placed on higher education, and the new oppressive EPA water and air rules. The third area that the call would be limited to is to limit the terms of office for its officials and for members of Congress. Our framers envisioned a citizen legislature, which we had for the most part until the 1950s. With the growth in the size and scope of the federal government and the power and influence with becoming a full-time politician, it is time that we at least look at putting term limits in place. Now, I want to repeat the three areas again that the call would be limited to impose fiscal restraints on the federal government, to limit the power and jurisdiction of the federal government, and to limit the terms of office for its officials and for members. 3 states have already passed the language we are considering today: Florida, Georgia, and Alaska. 31 states have introduced this language and are considering it this year. Now, let me clear up some misinformation that many of you received the last few days in emails about the progress of this resolution in other states. You've been told that all other states have rejected this resolution. It is true that in a few states, the Convention of States resolution has been narrowly defeated, but it's still alive and being considered in 20 states. In those 20 states, it has passed one house or the other in 5 of those states, and it's passed committees and is still moving in 6 of those states. Former U.S. Senator from Oklahoma, Tom Coburn, recently wrote an article for the Washington Times. He stated in that article, "Throughout my time in Washington, it was my goal to constrain the scope and the size of our federal government to that which our founders intended. There were successes along the way, of course, but the federal behemoth continues to grow almost unabated year after year, election cycle after election cycle. The reason for this is surprisingly simple. It's human nature to attempt to collect as much power and control as possible, and in few places is that more evident than Washington, D.C. Our national soul is being corrupted by Washington's unhindered and unconstitutional overreach. Our founders anticipated the federal government might get out of control at some point, and they gave us a constitutional mechanism to rein it in. It's called a Convention of States, outlined in Article 5 of the Constitution. I'm sure that you've received emails from people that are worried about the process, concerns that have been raised that a call like this could lead to a runaway convention that would completely destroy our federal Constitution. Let me assure you that such concerns are unfounded. First of all, Leader Norris passed a bill last year that became Public Chapter 979. This faithful delegate legislation, which other states have also passed, puts restraints on anyone that represents Tennessee at an Article 5 convention. Secondly, proposed constitutional amendments must pass an extremely high bar before they become part of our Constitution. First, 34 states have to issue an identical calling for a convention. Second, at a convention of states, a proposed amendment would then have to have 34 states approve the proposal before sending it to the states for ratification. Third, and finally, 38 states would have to ratify the amendment before it would become part of the Constitution. In the 50 states, there are 99 individual state legislative bodies. That means only 13 of the 99 could reject or stop any amendment to the federal Constitution. By far the most important safeguard that our founders built into this process. Mr. Speaker, that's an explanation of Senate Joint Resolution 67, and I yield to members for questions.
I've just met like the kindest, most welcoming people who have made me feel empowered.